I was too young to fully appreciate my first introduction to the philosopher Ludwig von Wittgenstein. What I remember from this Austrian-British philosopher of mind was his insistence on perspective being determinative of reality. That is, he says, a person who looks at a table from the top of the table is not seeing the same table as someone who is looking at the table from the underside. It was a hard sell on a 17-year-old college student, and it got even worse when I talked about it at home over lunch. My dad said, I'm paying for this. But the older I get, the more I recognize that Wittgenstein was really spot on. I'm white. You may not have noticed after 2 weeks in Brazil. I was the whitest man in Brazil. I'm an American. I'm male. I'm heterosexual. And even though I have traveled over much of the world, I've lived in an interracial family, I've enjoyed a lot of educational and diverse social experiences, I cannot see the police through the eyes of a black mother who has to let her sons go out and drive streets where they are going to be pulled over and harassed for driving while black. I can and I have spoken to violence against trans folk, but I can't speak to that as existentially as people who are within the community. I grew up around people who claimed that white privilege didn't exist, that their lives were also very hard in many ways. And they are. White families have addiction, alcoholism, violence. There were a lot of white folks that just absolutely denied that their whiteness was a source of privilege. And they would always wrap it up by saying, I never owned a slave. I never killed an Indian. I'm not prejudiced. And it's true enough that I am, my white friends say, one of those folks that never owned a slave nor killed a Native American. But I know my relatives did. And in my case, it's also true that I did not inherit a great deal of economic gain from my family. To the contrary, I ended up having to help them. But that doesn't mean that I have not enjoyed white privilege, and even that doesn't mean that reverse discrimination never exists. In specific cases, there have been times when being a white male may have excluded me from some opportunities, but that is only because the white male quota has been full for centuries. Just like the fish in David Foster Wallace's famous parable, who have lived their entire lives in water, but still don't know that water exists or what water is, we live in a universe where absolutely everything that we know only from our own perspective. I've been a pastor for 43 years, and I can tell you a lot about the abuses of church politics, the presumptions of sociopaths and con artists who manage to find a place onto a church board. But what I will never be able to feel is what it would have been like to have been a woman all these years and never even gotten a chance to be hired to work as a pastor of a church. No matter how smart, insightful, or well-educated she was, because in most of the world, the church only hires men. I've complained loudly about a lot of the toxic aspects of working for the church, but have rarely paused to consider that there were literally tens of thousands of seminary-educated women who would have loved to have traded places with me, to have spent a year in my shoes, even if they had to tolerate a lot of toxic sociopathic board meetings along the way, all of which end up in small groups in the parking lot. So enough said. You all know how much I love and adore my daughter, and yet you locals have also had to see the mutual admiration society that exists between the two of us. What we never saw was what that whole international adoption would have looked like from the perspective of the young Korean woman who gave birth to her 32 years ago, and likely had very little choice in the matter of getting up out of her hospital bed and leaving without her baby. My greatest joy in life is the source of another person's greatest pain in life. A woman whose name I've never even known. So you see, Wittgenstein is right, because both perspectives are true. It was one historical event, but we experienced it dramatically differently. And the mere fact that thinking about Valerie's birth mother made you uncomfortable, imagine how it makes me feel. It makes me sad, it makes me uncomfortable, and at times it makes me feel very guilty about my own good fortune. And yet it does not change the facts. Now, I think that I'm a fairly clever boy most of the time. I don't even care if you agree. But when David and I have our weekly meetings, we talk about the issues that we think we really have to talk about. In terms of what is available for progressive sermons online these days, we're almost in a category by ourselves of trying to speak ethically and spiritually about current events. And so we try to work out what needs to be said next. And we talk about matters of sexual orientation, of gay and trans rights. And when that subject comes around, even though we're walking usually to get tacos in Springfield, I can tell by the look on David's face that I still don't get it. Now, I was fighting for gay rights back when David was not yet aware of their own orientation, or at least not entirely admitting it. He was still trying to fight to maintain his position as a Southern Baptist pastor. So even though I have a lot more tenure in the fight than even David does, while I can be an advocate, I can never see that table from any but the perspective that I was born to. We're both members of the NAACP, or have been. We've demonstrated with Black Lives Matter, but there are times when we recognize that there's a subject that neither one of us should feel like we have a right to speak to, and that's when we'll reach out and try to grab a person of color to deliver the message that goes into our catalog of messages that we think has to be there. It's a part of our regular conversations. Do we have the right to speak to this issue? And Sean and I often even have to wonder about the music in a service. Can white musicians do this particular song? Are we wrong to speak to these issues, or would we be more wrong to fail to speak to these issues? And if it has to be said, are we the right people to do it? Now, George, I appreciate the fact that you've declared that I'm the blackest preacher in Springfield. I feel like I've been around a number of black clergymen who would not agree with that. The Black Lives Matter movement, especially during the Trump administration's, let's just call it what it was, an overt racist administration, has helped a lot of us to become aware, become awakened to how much racism really has been a part of the cultural water that we've been swimming in all of our lives. But now just look at the backlash we're seeing from the white folks who do not want critical race theory taught in schools. Now, you cannot rationally dispute the historical facts, but people will dismiss the facts because the facts make them feel uncomfortable. I am certain that many German kids are made to feel uncomfortable when their history classes talk about the Holocaust and Germany's fascist history. However, that discomfort doesn't keep Germany from including Holocaust history in their school classes. And it hasn't even prevented them from restoring Auschwitz and Dachau so that their own people will remember how far they got off of sanity. Still, the resistance of the right wing in America to facts is not something that especially surprises me. I doubt that it surprises you. You will recall I've mentioned several times that even though I've written nearly 1,000 newspaper articles over the years, but I've only written one for my hometown paper in Glasgow, Kentucky. And I've told you about when I learned that the bronze statue to our Confederate dead still stood on the courthouse lawn in my hometown, that I wrote an essay suggesting not that it be destroyed, but that it be removed to a Civil War cemetery a couple of miles away from the courthouse so that there was not a direct association with this symbol of white supremacy in front of the courthouse steps, that it could be a tribute to the people that died in the Civil War and put it in a cemetery. I had no idea that there were so many people in Glasgow, Kentucky who read the newspaper, especially reading it online. But within 1 hour of that essay being posted, I had received 75 angry responses, many of which told me that I was not welcome to ever visit my hometown again. It's been hard to deal with the loss. And a few assuring me that they would kill me on sight if I ever came back. But there was one entry from a black resident of Glasgow who talked about what it had felt like his whole life when he had to walk across the square every day after school and see that monument and how sick it made him feel. Now, many of the people who threatened me also took the time to assure me that they were not racist in the least. This was about their relatives and their history. But what was clear was that they were not able to see that monument from another perspective. Their reality was not the reality of the black people who live in Glasgow, Kentucky. Everyone else who penned an angry response was just certain that remembering the Civil War was not a racist exercise. But they were just like a fish that doesn't know what water is. They have swum in that racism for so long. It just is the way the world is. We should understand that a fish that doesn't know what water is not necessarily an evil fish. It's just an unaware fish. Our neighbors, our family members, who have refused to acknowledge that Civil War monuments are almost always a statement of white supremacy, also doesn't mean that they are inherently evil. It feels like they are. But I think we have to let go of the idea that people who have not been awakened must be given the opportunity to become awakened. Being wrong doesn't make you evil. However, refusing to understand, refusing to grow, refusing to correct your old prejudices, refusing to engage in critical thinking, that is the gateway to being evil. You may not be evil, but that's the direction you're pointed in if you refuse to correct those prejudices. All of us who have lost contact with family members and old friends during the Trump era have expressed both moral shock and outrage at the racist sentiments, either tacitly or directly supported by people that we used to think had more sense. But the really breathtaking aspect of it all is that they sincerely do not see it. They do not see how inherently racist Trump's policies and tweets really were. For most of us, white privilege is exactly like fish swimming in water. It's so much a part of us that it's part of our cultural assumptions. It becomes the way that we speak, and that then becomes the way you hire. to whom you will rent an apartment, and now what we will even allow to be taught in our schools. It may be an indisputable fact that white European settlers stole the wealth of the natural resources and land of North America through a genocide of tens of millions of Native Americans. It may be a fact that we developed the wealth of the nation through African slavery, and that we expanded the borders of America by some 40% through what can only be described as pathological land theft from Latin Americans. But the truth of these things does not mean that this generation of white people want their children to be told, because it makes them feel like maybe they don't deserve to be in a place of social superiority, that they might be made to feel that it is not fair that they have a better shot at education, at employment, at success. The mere fact that we really didn't earn it, the mere fact that it really isn't fair, is immaterial. It makes the Karens, I've promised to quit using that term, but it makes the Karens of the world uncomfortable. And because it makes them uncomfortable, we are simply not supposed to say it. Compare that to Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the playing of the national anthem, that people have been so angry and wanting to fire him and get him out, not because his protest wasn't legitimate, not because he didn't have a good reason to protest. Anyone that's ever read the lyrics to the national anthem would know that it promises black folks, if they try to escape slavery, that they will be killed and put in a grave. Why would we ever expect a black person to kneel for that? Why would we ever expect a white person with self-respect to stand for that? Now, I don't know what all of the necessary elements of ending racism in America are, but this one thing I'm certain of, that not being willing to teach the historical facts will prevent progress in one generation after another. How many of us just found out that there had been a Tulsa race riot 100 years ago? Not taught in schools, not mentioned in schools. I only found out about it by going to Tulsa, and a friend gave me a tour of the area a few years ago. But we don't tell the truth in our history classes, and we set up generation after generation to, as I like to say, I feel innocent. I may not be innocent, but I feel innocent. And that's important to me, you see. I think that we are in a unique time in history when a number of things have worked together to heighten our awareness of how race has been a factor in every aspect of the building of our modern society. And it's not just in America. A lot of American slave owners moved to Brazil after the Civil War. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to end African slavery. Other countries actually started the slave trade. Those weren't our boats, after all. Those were Dutch and British and Portuguese boats that were bringing slaves over. But in our day, the advent of cameras and cell phones has alone made it possible for the public to see what actually happened before the police were able to polish a propaganda statement. The whole of Black Lives Matter movement has brought articulate leaders to the front of a movement to educate America. Still, very sadly, it is possible, folks, that we could let this opportunity slip through our fingers. I would remind you that a decade ago, the Occupy Wall Street movement came into being as a response to the way that the government had chosen to bail out banks in the 2008 financial crisis rather than bailing out homeowners and wage earners. For the same amount of money, we could have simply refinanced those bad mortgage loans, kept people in their houses. The banks would have gotten the money they were owed, not extra, but they would have gotten what they were owed, and American families would have stayed in their houses. So the Occupy Wall Street movement was well-founded. They were sounding all the right notes. They were occupying the moral high ground in the dispute. but then it just fell apart. Some people will say it fell apart because they didn't have visible leadership. But you know what? I think the real reason it fell apart was that winter came early that year, and that the protesters found it increasingly difficult to maintain their encampments in public parks. My friend John Churcher in Great Britain has said that Great Britain will never have another revolution because it rains too often. With all of the media coverage of police killings and the progress made in electing people of color and the naked power grab behind voter suppression moves being made in Republican legislatures all over America, folks, we cannot let this moment slip through our fingers. This is, may I say this is no time for weak liberalism. Liberals will have strongly held convictions that they will abandon if it rains too hard. It is not enough for we white people to be not racist. We have to figure out how to be anti-racist. That does not mean that white liberals need to posture themselves as saviors of a downtrodden American black community or brown community, but folks, it isn't like racism was the brainchild of black and brown people, was it? Racism is primarily a white disease. We're not called to cheer from the sidelines when we're in control of the ball on the field. White people invented racism, defended it, sustained it, denied it, and passed it on to generation after generation. So reading books by prominent black authors, listening to historians and sociologists as they expose the role of race in our wealth disparity, in our inequitable prison sentences, in police violence, in hiring discrimination, and roadblocks to higher education, that is all a part of being anti-racist. So yeah, critical race theory needs to be taught in schools. But I'm just, what I'm unsure of, I know you all are always more interested when I tell you I'm unsure of something. What I'm unsure of is whether we even need a fancy title like critical race theory. Because what we're talking about is telling the truth about history. I mean, isn't that what it really is? That we're just more facts, less fiction, more honesty, fewer lies. And while we're at it, that wouldn't hurt religion or politics either. More facts, less fiction, tell the truth. And I need to say this to you who are my closest friends and allies. I don't think we should ever underestimate the power that exists in changing the way that we think and changing the way that our peer groups think. American democracy, liberty, freedom, equality does not exist as an external fact. Christopher Columbus didn't get lost in land on an island in the Caribbean and go back to Europe to report that he had discovered democracy or liberty or freedom or equality, because those things don't exist in physical form. They are ideas, and they are perfected in critical thought. Irrational prejudice against gay, lesbian, and trans folk has been a part of Western civilization for centuries, but it only began to change when the majority of people who were not gay, lesbian, or trans began to change the way they think. The reality for minority folk in the world of every ilk improves through better education and awareness of the majority, not on the part of the minority. Trans folk are rarely anti-trans, you see. Black folk are rarely racist against black people. This is the problem of the white cis community. So the majority bears the responsibility for the social change. Consider the matter of the XL pipeline that was going through the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. Huge international investment. It was said that it could not be stopped because there was too much money involved. There was the American government. There was the Canadian government that wanted to sell a product that should have stayed in the ground. And then there were the recipients of the oil, because we weren't going to use it. We don't need it. We're exporting oil. So China, you got Canada, the United States, and China all behind it, along with billions of dollars. Obama was so nervous about it that he did not make a definitive decision. Trump then gave it the green light to push for its completion, but years of protest, in which most of us have played a part, has finally ended this stupid, ecologically and morally corrupt project. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't get to say this often enough, but we won. We won. It took us a long time, and maybe it's hard to celebrate a victory that took this long to achieve, but we won. It took years of sacrifice, and some real leaders are still in prison for what they did. But as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. You need only consider our current predicament with the pandemic. Safe, effective, miraculous vaccines are now available to everyone who is willing to get it. And yet more than half of our neighbors and friends and coworkers have refused to be vaccinated. Our city recently withdrew all COVID restrictions in public places. I was at the farmer's market yesterday wearing the only mask among hundreds of people crowded in together. And yet, during the time that I was out of town, our hospitalization rate of COVID patients tripled. I've only been back in the USA for 48 hours, but it's hard to find anyone who is acting like they know that we're still in a pandemic. This is a perfect example of how refusing to believe in the truth and insisting on believing untruths actually will result in a death toll and lifetimes of permanent disability. How we think shapes the world in which we live. It is that simple. Compassion leads us to take care of those who are sick, as well as those who are victims of racism and other kinds of prejudice. But faith, our spirituality, inspires us to help people to stay healthy, not just, as one author wrote, it's not enough to keep pulling drowning people out of the river unless we're willing to go upriver and see who keeps throwing them in. That there is a point at which we can be proactive in changing the way that people think that has created wealth disparity, racism, prejudice, and ignorance. We are to be, first and foremost, a prophetic community, a real hazard to ignorance, and a source for the kind of thinking that can make the world a better place. And so, my friends, have courage. Believe what is true, reject what is false, and question everything, especially authority.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.